Hi, my name is Emily Jordan, and I'm going to be presenting on the portrait of Cosimo de' Medici by Vespasiano de Bisticci. And just to begin with, I'm going to start with some background on Cosimo de' Medici. He was the son of Giovanni di Bicci, who built up the Medici Bank, and Giovanni di Bicci actually started as a moneylender, then founded the Medici Bank in Florence. And Cosimo was really responsible for extending the reach of the Medici Bank to branches in Rome, Geneva, Venice, and Naples, and later throughout Western Europe. Cosimo and his heirs worked to maintain control of the government through an elaborate political system supported by their wealth. They essentially brought the city under their influence without disturbing the formal republic appearance of the government, and instead working through a complex web of allies and clients and amici. Cosimo was responsible for cultivating Florence's world of artistic innovation and humanist learning, and his network of partisans helped him outmaneuver the Albizzi in the 1430s and maintain control of Florence. The Medicis essentially maintained that they were ordinary citizens within the Republic, though in reality they functioned more like princes. Their concern with image led them to patronize sumptuous works of art and palaces like the Palazzo Medici, and Vespasiano's biography of Cosimo that we're going to look at today is no exception in their propaganda campaign. The first point that I wanted to pull from our reading was that Vespasiano tries to really depict Cosimo as the ideal humanist citizen. He offers a very sympathetic and intimate study of Cosimo and tries to emphasize his humanist characteristics. So he states that Cosimo has a strong grasp of Latin, and his only friends are really learned men who he associates with in his immediate circle, and the only leisure he engages in is an occasional game of chess. Vespasiano claims that Cosimo had honorable descent. However, this claim is pretty dubious because, as I mentioned before, his father was a banker, so he probably didn't really have any noble lineage. He also states that Cosimo was a great patron of the arts, and a quote that I pulled was, he had dealings with painters and sculptors and had in his house works of diverse masters. And he also states that Cosimo was greatly concerned with ethics. At the end of the reading, he states that Cosimo asked for Aristotle's Ethics to be read aloud to him before his death. And this is very interesting because it kind of shows that Cosimo de' Medici he had a conscience about how he gained his money, and he probably struggled with the ethics and morality because he was guilty of the greatest sin, usury, as we mentioned before, which is, charging people for loans and profiting off money that you lend out to your clients. And as I mentioned before, he was a patron of architects, painters, and sculptors. He had the architect Michelozzo build his Medici Palace and Chapel, and he commissioned works of art from Donatello, Ghiberti, Cassetagno, excuse my pronunciation on that, Angelico, and more. Cosimo treated these artists as friends at a time where people kind of looked down upon artists as manual workers. And his study of Cosimo is very intimate. He also adds a lot of vignettes and tidbits about his personality. For example, he describes Cosimo's garden at San Marco, where he says that Cosimo de' Medici does all the fruit planting, pruning, and grafting all by himself. This kind of brings him down to earth and tries to paint a more human portrait of him. He also speaks to his generosity, offering an example of this figure of Messer Tommaso, who asked him for a loan, and Marsilio, the son of Vicino. And in both cases, Cosimo kind of generously gives the two men loans, and da Bisticci cleverly frames these loans as generous gifts, although these gifts of money would have been very profitable and politically advantageous to Cosimo de' Medici, who largely built up his wealth and power through these examples of usury and his network of client-patron relationships. He also represents kind of a shift in the instruments of political power, because in contrast to his forefathers, he would not kill his enemies. He instead exiled them, which shows kind of his benevolence and his fairness as a ruler. And his main tools of obligation were his loans he gave out to his supporters, so he mainly uses his money as a way to consolidate power. And he was also indicative of a changing patriciate class, and da Bisticci's biography reveals this. So Cosimo was part of a class who was exercising this phenomenon of conspicuous consumption that we talked about in previous readings. And it's essentially evidence of changing societal values and a trend toward more visible luxury. So spending money on commissioning his sumptuous Medici palace and his chapel and works of art and sculptures in order to project his wealth. And in the text, Bisticci talks of the living standard of the Medici palace would have been way more luxurious than any of his ancestors would have ever known. So it's a really mercantile and very Florentine example of societal values and these shifting values in the patriciate class. The final thing I wanted to talk about was how Vespasiano frames Cosimo's rise to power. And the Medicis derived a lot of their power from their strong ties with the papacy. In 1410, his father had lent John the 23rd money to buy himself the office of cardinal. And once John became pope, he made the Medici Bank head of all papal finances as like kind of a return on their investment. And this allowed them to exercise extreme power. It allowed the Medici to threaten debtors with excommunication because of their ties to the church. And Cosimo's power in Florence also stemmed from his wealth, which da Bisticci references in the text. He talks about the wealth that Cosimo used to control the votes of the Signoria, and this was completely true. He was able to control the votes of office holders in municipal councils, and especially the Signoria in Florence. And ultimately, what we can kind of glean from this is Vespasiano's piece about Cosimo de' Medici is a great piece of propaganda. He depicts Cosimo de' Medici as benevolent, generous, and the perfect humanist man. It's a very idealized portrait and is extremely embellished. He rarely criticizes him for anything. And this depiction would have been, of course, very advantageous to Cosimo for his family's legacy and public perception as the most powerful man and family in Florence. This pretty laudatory and uncritical biography is not completely useless, though. It shows us how the public would have seen him and reveals a lot about societal norms and the ideal characteristics that Florentines would look for in a humanist man. And finally, here are just some discussion questions that I came up with. One, does Vespasiano de' Bisticci paint a positive or negative portrait of Cosimo de' Medici, and what does he criticize or praise him for? Two, what does da Bisticci's biography reveal about a changing patriciate class in Florentine society? And the last one, Bisticci asserts his biography is the actual truth. How reliable do you think Bisticci's account is? Thank you so much.